So, let's start running through some of these, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of these as we go through these slides. Feel free to read through them. I think, as researchers, we do not need to shy away from essentially the humanistic arguments. We need to absolutely embrace them. As Quinney has said, abolition of the prison is an integral and seamless part of enlightenment and human liberation. You know, for those of us who are still working on the Enlightenment project, prison abolition, PIC abolition, this is all on that path. There will be a day where there will not be prisons, for example. That is as certain to me as I am about my name. They went around 200 years ago, and as long as we're working on human liberation and the Enlightenment project, that too is on its way. Again, talking about history, connecting this not just, for example, you know, the incarceration rate in the United States now is 760 on average. It's the highest in the world. Within the United States, however, for whites it's 487, for African Americans it's 3,161. And we need to tie that not just as a reformist saying, oh, that's a problem, racism in the PIC, but we need to tie this to that's the reformist argument, but we need to tie these to abolition. We need to say, look, it's always been this way. And maybe before we filled it with blacks, it was filled with Irish. And why was it filled with Irish? Because this is how Irish were perceived at the time. The system doesn't change. The contents does. The orientation doesn't. But the establishment stays the same. So the abolitionist argument has to go down, I would say, this lane. And of course, the same with all these items. Talking about the history of sexism within the PIC. In prisons, for example, while it's extremely important to emphasize what happens with women and how they're the fastest growing population, for example, in American prisons, we must also not forget to talk about how it's been always mostly men. And why that is, and how that connects to power in society and hierarchy, etc. The history of the PIC addressing the bad people, as if there is such a thing in a society, good people and bad people. No, there's just you and me. Or looking at the history of the criminal justice system as a management technique for all these groups. And how, in the history of the PIC, people are written off. How that's an integral part. The all matters is the word that I like to use. Everybody who's involved in any way. Whether it's somebody who committed a harm, somebody who suffered a harm, a family member of any one of those persons, etc. Fastly running out of time here. So some ideological arguments. Everything is ideological. So let's just not pretend that that's not going on here. Okay? Let's just quit pretending that there's no ideology. There's a definite ideology here, and there's no shame in embracing it. And it has to do, I always tell my students that most of the conversations about justice in society, crime, whatever insufficient word you want to use, goes on without ever distinguishing how behind those conversations is an assumption of who human beings are and what their nature is. In the States, we're divided between Rousseau and Hobbes. On the one hand, we think people are fabulous and reformable, so we spend all this money, some money, on reform, like drug reform, etc., alternative courts, etc. On the other hand, we're kind of Hobbesian. We think people are completely evil, and the only way we're going to get through them is punish them as much as possible. We can advocate, as abolitionists, for the need to distinguish that, first of all, and secondly, that we need to embrace a different model of human nature as perhaps more accurate. I think Durkheim's idea of the leaky faucet, which is essentially, look, stop thinking about crime as something that you're going to stop. Stop thinking about it like it's a leaky faucet. There's never been a time without crime. There's never going to be a time without crime. You need to figure out a way to deal with crime as an essential part of human existence in a way that's going to be less harmful. The same, I think, in terms of ethics and values research. And, of course, there's a lot of work to do in terms of research with ethics of humanism in the criminal justice system and some key values looking at human conflict as innate and how that relates to abolition of PIC. harms and their significance in social life, the extremely positive role that they play, and of course, the 3 R's, reparation, reconciliation, and restoration. Other ideological arguments include the abolition of revenge argument, teasing that out in great detail, the abolition of punishment argument. Some of this work has been done, but there's a lot more to do. Tremendous amount of work on language. As somebody who works on language, I know it as a huge resource of getting to the bottom of a lot of what we're doing in our everyday life with PIC. Finally, political and economic arguments. And here I'm going to really run through these, maybe just stopping on a couple. Looking, of course, again, critically, not from a reformist perspective, but arguing it from the logic of abolition, and always importantly, doing that via tying in history, the complete and total failure at all steps of the criminal justice system, which is what's made finally in history web and the political process going, maybe there's something here. The complete absence of a functional system to deal with harms in alma maters. One of my favorite things in the world is Mark Maurer wrote this piece in which he used what he calls the criminal justice funnel. And maybe it's somebody else's, but he doesn't credit one, so I think it's his. And the top of the funnel is, the millions and millions and millions of harmful acts that are committed a day. And then he starts going through, the ones that get arrested, called, the cops arrested, prosecuted, convicted, etc. At the very bottom, you have, some thousands of harms that are actually dealt with by a prison sentence or, a probation or something. And he says, and that's the PIC's message, that those millions and millions and millions of harms have been dealt with by putting these few hundred thousands in some kind of a response. That's preposterous. Costs, of course, the state criminalization of more and more things, mental health, immigration, anyone threatening the property's class, sense of privilege and safety. Of course, the profiteering, the politics of fear and social control, employment. Somebody was mentioning this a little bit earlier. This is just, I can tell you as somebody who teaches American youth, this is their #1 concern now. I just taught a course in corrections. At the end of the semester, I had them give me the 10 arguments that they considered the most convincing of the course. And I had them read Angela Davis's Our Prisons Obsolete. And in the critique of that, one of the most common arguments was, we clearly can't abolish the system because there's too many jobs at stake. I mean, this is this is college students, sophomores and juniors, thinking straight about this. And as ridiculous as that sounds, connect to a moment how that's a real issue for them. And if it's a real issue for them, imagine what it is in the rest of the country. Electoral politics, intentional avoidance of the social justice, not welfare state. We need to shift that conversation. It's not about a welfare state. It's about a social justice state. Culture of violence, etc. Run through these on your own. Okay, some quick concluding thoughts. So I would say to you that yes, we do need a detailed, pragmatic, and reasoned vision for abolition in the U.S. from the academic community. We must ensure that this abolitionist research is undiluted, unreformist, and constructed, as I've been saying all along, in the history in the light of history, reason, and pragmatism. Forget this utopian and radical perspective. I have never heard anything more ridiculous in my life than to call PIC abolition radical and utopian. That's the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard in my life. There is nothing unreasonable about it. It is the only rational, reasonable conclusion you can come to when you study the facts. And there's no other way to talk about it. You want to talk about utopians, or dystopia, that's what we're living in now. We need a research program that's topically diverse and linguistically inventive. This is a huge research project. This is immense. We need venues to share and publish abolition research for academics to encourage and promote conferences, peer-reviewed journals, book series, etc. We need this research to advocate in the public realm, policymakers, the media. We need this research to make abolition a presence in undergraduate programs, to make a presence in graduate programs, and to build to a point where we have graduate programs examining simply this, producing more and more such research. We need this research to stand for something and not only against something. And last, a couple of scholar-activist abolition goals, looking at the symbiotic relationship between abolition researchers and abolition activists, Madison's short-term reforms, as well as Popinski's, we need to change the conversation entirely. I think we're still at a time where we need both. Others have said that this weekend. Our abolition means new relationships where community members are active and not just sort of these automans of society. What's going to replace this has to be something that we're all deeply involved in a restorative justice kind of way. I think we need to be cautious in drawing parallels with other abolition movements. Sure, slavery abolition, death penalty abolition are great abolition movements, but they're very, very different. And I know they're very complicated in their own sense, but PIC abolition is immensely complicated, immensely dimensional. And we need to be, as scholar activists, we need to be working for amnesty goals in terms of who's in prison now and what should happen with those in prison. And we need to be working for adding the PIC into the Declaration of Human Rights. Again, I'm going to finish with saying that it is critical that abolition research arguments be made in an abolition logic and not in a reform logic. And it is critical that they be drawn against the historical consistency of the criminal justice system. And that's it.